Boy leaves note on stranger's door daily. What's written inside brings tears. It was a crisp autumn morning in the small, tight-knit town of Maplewood, a place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The air was filled with the smell of damp leaves and freshly baked bread from the local bakery, and the golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets. It seemed like any other peaceful morning, but behind the calm facade, something was amiss. At the corner of Oak Street, near a modest two-story house at the end of the block, a young boy named Ethan stood before a worn front door. He was no more than 12, his oversized jacket swaying with the wind as he carefully placed an envelope inside the rusted mailbox. His hands trembled as he wrote the note, sealing it with quiet determination. Ethan was just a child, but he had no idea that the words he scribbled every day would soon unravel a mystery that no one in Maplewood could have predicted. Inside the house lived a reclusive woman, Mrs. Abigail Monroe, a widow in her late 60s. She had lived in Maplewood for over 30 years, keeping to herself, rarely speaking to anyone. Little did she know, the note left by the boy would set a series of events in motion that would change her life forever. What began as a simple gesture of kindness soon spiraled into something far more complicated. Dark secrets would be revealed, and a town that thought it knew everything would find itself on the brink of revelation. For weeks, Ethan had been leaving the notes, each one carrying words of encouragement, kindness, and simple observations about the world around him. Mrs. Monroe never responded, and Ethan never expected her to. He simply hoped that his small gestures would bring a smile to the woman who seemed to carry a weight on her shoulders. But one morning, something changed. The envelope he left behind wasn't there when he returned that evening. A strange feeling gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. Curiosity got the better of him, and Ethan decided to watch from a distance, hidden among the trees near Mrs. Monroe's porch. That's when he saw it, her hands shaking as she held a crumpled note close to her chest. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew. Why would a simple note provoke such a reaction? Days passed, and the once quiet town began to buzz with whispers. People had noticed changes. Mrs. Monroe's once distant demeanor seemed to soften, her routine now filled with anxious energy. But it wasn't just the woman who was changing. Ethan, too, was starting to feel the pull of something bigger. His small, innocent act had set off a chain of events, one that would reveal secrets long buried and force both him and Mrs. Monroe to face truths they weren't prepared for. Ethan Parker was a quiet, introspective boy with an old soul. Despite his tender age of 12, he had a way of seeing the world that others often overlooked. Raised by his mother, a school teacher in Maplewood, Ethan had learned early on the value of kindness, empathy, and the belief that small gestures could have a lasting impact. He'd been raised in a house filled with books and stories. His mother's gentle way of teaching him life lessons through literature made him mature beyond his years. However, there was also a sense of isolation that accompanied Ethan's personality. His father had died when he was just a toddler, and although he had a handful of friends at school, Ethan often found solace in his own company. His connection with Mrs. Monroe had started with simple, childlike curiosity. Her house always looked abandoned, and yet there was something about her that intrigued him. But what began as innocent admiration soon morphed into something deeper as Ethan felt an unexplained connection to the lonely widow. Mrs. Abigail Monroe was a woman who had seen too much in her lifetime. A widow for over 2 decades, Abigail had retreated from the world after the tragic death of her husband, Daniel Monroe, a local businessman who had been well liked in town. The love they shared had been palpable, and when he passed away suddenly from a heart attack, she was left shattered. She hadn't been the same since. She had no children, and her family had long since moved away, leaving her to care for her decaying house alone. Abigail found comfort in solitude, surrounded by the memories of a life she could never fully move on from. But there was something darker beneath the surface, something she'd kept hidden for years, buried so deeply that even she had almost forgotten it. Until Ethan started leaving those notes. Detective Marcus Avery was the man who would eventually become entwined in their lives. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most complex cases, Marcus had seen it all. He'd spent over 15 years on the force, working his way up the ranks from a young officer in the city to the respected detective he was today. But even with his experience, Marcus couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this case was different. Maplewood wasn't a place that saw much crime, and what had initially seemed like a harmless act of kindness, the notes left by a boy for a reclusive woman, had begun to show signs of something much darker lurking beneath the surface. Marcus's instincts told him that there was more to the story. But the question was, how far would it go? It was a cold, dreary morning when Abigail Monroe's life changed forever. The sun had barely risen over Maplewood when the discovery was made. Ethan Parker, the quiet boy from down the street, was found dead on her front porch. His body lay sprawled across the steps, a crumpled note clutched tightly in his hand. Abigail had heard the knock on her door late the night before, but in her exhaustion, she dismissed it as a passing thought. She never could have imagined that the boy who had become a strange, almost daily visitor would be lying lifeless in front of her home the next morning. The initial reaction from the town was one of disbelief. Ethan, the quiet, well-mannered boy, couldn't have been the victim of something so horrific. The local police arrived at the scene shortly after the body was discovered, and Detective Marcus Avery was called in to oversee the investigation. At first, it seemed like a simple case, a tragic accident perhaps. Ethan had been known to ride his bike near Mrs. Monroe's house, often leaving notes at her door. Innocent gestures that had puzzled some, but never seemed dangerous. But as Avery examined the scene more closely, a troubling thought began to form. Ethan's death wasn't an accident. The note in his hand was smeared with blood, the ink running in dark streaks. Marcus studied the message, but the words were barely legible. It was clear that Ethan had written it in a hurry, and whatever was inside the note had been important enough to leave behind. The handwriting was familiar to him. Ethan's handwriting, but it seemed frantic, more rushed than usual. The note was the first piece of evidence that couldn't be ignored. What had Ethan been trying to say? Witness statements from the neighbors were conflicting. Some swore they saw Ethan the night before, riding his bike home, while others claimed they hadn't seen him at all. No one had heard any cries for help or signs of struggle. But one neighbor, Mrs. Green, reported seeing a shadow near Abigail's house just after midnight. She couldn't make out the figure's face, but remembered seeing someone lingering near the porch. When questioned, Mrs. Monroe denied having seen anyone. She had stayed inside, watching her old films, as she always did. As the investigation unfolded, the contradictions only deepened. Was Ethan targeted by someone close to him? Was there something sinister about the notes he had been leaving at Abigail's door? The more Marcus delved into Ethan's relationship with Mrs. Monroe, the more questions arose. Why had the boy been so obsessed with this woman? And could Abigail, the lonely widow, have been involved in his death, either directly or indirectly? The investigation seemed to grow more complicated with every passing day. Detective Marcus Avery had hoped for a breakthrough, but instead, he found himself chasing shadows. The case was full of false leads, dead ends, and eerie coincidences that only deepened the mystery surrounding Ethan Parker's death. It all began with the discovery of a second note. This one found in the alley behind Mrs. Monroe's house. It was nearly identical to the first one, except this time it was addressed to Abigail herself. The handwriting was Ethan's, but the tone was different, more urgent, almost pleading. "I know what you did," the note began, and then trailed off, the rest of the ink smudged beyond legibility. The discovery threw everything into turmoil. Who was Ethan accusing? And what had he known? Did he know something about Mrs. Monroe? Or was he trying to tell the world something about his own life, his own fears? As Marcus tried to piece the puzzle together, he found himself drawn into a web of contradictions. He learned that Mrs. Monroe had been a regular at the local library, where Ethan was often seen. Witnesses claimed that he was fascinated by her, often staring at her for hours. But when questioned, Abigail remained tight-lipped about their interactions. She denied any unusual connection to the boy, insisting that she had never seen him as anything more than a friendly neighborhood kid. Yet her demeanor seemed off. Her avoidance of certain topics was unsettling. Then Kam die gemeentebeheerder aan. Another suspect, Lucas Harris, Ethan's estranged father. Lucas had been out of town the night Ethan was found, but his alibi was shaky. He claimed to have been on a business trip, but the details didn't add up. He was known for his volatile temper, and some of the neighbors remembered seeing him arguing with Ethan in the days leading up to the boy's death. Lucas was a man who had a history of trouble with the law, and his anger towards his son had never been a secret. Was this a case of an angry father taking revenge, or was there more to the story? As Detective Avery dug deeper into Lucas' past, he uncovered a chilling secret. Lucas had been involved in a similar incident years earlier, where another boy had gone missing under strange circumstances. The case had never been solved, and some of the details mirrored Ethan's death too closely to ignore. Was this a coincidence, or had the past finally caught up with Lucas Harris? Meanwhile, the investigation team, a small group of dedicated officers, began to feel the strain of the case. Every lead felt like a false promise, and every new piece of evidence raised more questions. They were running out of time, and the more they dug, the more they felt the weight of something much darker looming just out of sight. Just as Detective Marcus Avery thought he was closing in on the truth, the unexpected happened. A call came through late one night, an anonymous tip that led him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, he found something that left his heart racing. Inside, a hidden compartment revealed a collection of photographs, dozens of snapshots featuring Ethan Parker and Mrs. Monroe, some taken just days before his death. The chilling part? In every single photo, Ethan appeared to be watching her, his eyes filled with an unsettling intensity. But before Avery could process the significance of the photographs, another twist threw everything off course. One of the officers, responding to a separate lead, stumbled upon a piece of torn clothing near the site where Ethan's body was found. The fabric matched the jacket that Mrs. Monroe had been wearing in the weeks before Ethan's death. Was this evidence pointing back to her? Or was someone framing her? The investigation team was split, with some pushing for a closer look at Lucas Harris and others becoming increasingly suspicious of Abigail Monroe's strange behavior. Just as they were about to interview her again, an unexpected breakthrough occurred. Lucas was spotted near the old library, the one place he claimed to have never been. As Marcus stared at the footage, a question nagged at him. Could Lucas have been hiding something far more sinister than anyone had imagined? What was he really doing there? The case had been full of twists and turns, but nothing had prepared Detective Marcus Avery for what he was about to uncover. The breakthrough came during a routine forensic review of Ethan Parker's phone records. Something didn't add up. Among the myriad of mundane messages and calls, one stood out. There was a final message sent to a mysterious number just hours before his death, one that was not registered to anyone they had on their list of suspects. The number was untraceable, and yet something about it felt eerily familiar. Avery pushed further, knowing there was a link he hadn't discovered yet. That's when it hit him. Ethan's final text had been sent to none other than Abigail Monroe, his seemingly perfect alibi. It was a message unlike anything the detective had ever expected. I know what you did, and I'm telling Marcus tonight. It's over. The revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation team. What could this mean? Had Ethan discovered something about Abigail that no one else knew? Was it possible she had been hiding a secret far darker than anyone imagined? But the shock didn't stop there. Avery's team managed to trace the unknown number back to a local clinic, a small, family-run practice that had been closed for years. There, they unearthed the unthinkable. Abigail's name was linked to the clinic, not as a patient, but as an employee. And one of the other names on the clinic's records was none other than Ethan's father, a man who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. What no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that Abigail Monroe, the woman everyone had believed was the victim's savior, had been hiding a dark and twisted past, a past intertwined with Ethan's father, one that had never been fully explained. Was Abigail involved in Ethan's father's disappearance all those years ago? Was her connection to the clinic the key to unraveling everything? The detective's mind raced. What had Ethan uncovered, and why was Abigail willing to go so far to hide the truth? As Detective Avery stood before the Monroe family's grand home, he could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The air was thick with anticipation as he prepared to confront Abigail. Her demeanor had always been calm, composed, almost too perfect. But now everything had changed. The new revelations about her connection to the clinic and the sinister link to Ethan's father painted a picture he had never imagined. Avery stood by the door and waited, watching Abigail from the shadows. The moment she stepped out, he could see the cracks in her facade. Her face, usually so collected, showed the faintest hint of worry. But it was her eyes. Her eyes told a different story. For the first time, They weren't cold and guarded. They were filled with an unspoken guilt. "Detective, what's this all about?" Abigail's voice was steady, but Avery could sense the tension beneath it. Before he could respond, a soft, trembling voice interrupted. Ethan's mother, Olivia Parker, appeared in the doorway, her tear-streaked face hauntingly familiar. She had been a quiet presence throughout the investigation, but now, as she came forward, her grief was palpable. I can't believe it," Olivia choked, clutching at her chest. "Why? Why would anyone hurt my son?" The detective turned to her, his heart heavy with the pain of the moment. "Mrs. Parker, we believe we found the truth, but it's going to be hard to hear." For the first time since the investigation began, Olivia let out a loud sob. Not Abigail. She was always there for Ethan. She was like a daughter to me, her voice cracked. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me this isn't happening." Abigail's face fell. She could no longer hide from the truth. The once perfect alibi she had so carefully constructed was crumbling. And now, with Olivia's tears falling before her, she could no longer deny the weight of the consequences. "Ethan knew something," Abigail whispered, her voice barely audible. "He found out everything. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I had no choice." The confession hung in the air, a crushing moment of realization that ripped through the hearts of those involved. Abigail had been hiding something monstrous, and the revelation was more than anyone could have ever prepared for. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Detective Avery faced Abigail once again. The tension was suffocating. The once polished woman now sat with her hands trembling on the table, her eyes darting nervously between the officer and the door, as though searching for a way out. "What's it going to be, Abigail?" Avery's voice was firm, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You can keep hiding, or you can tell us the truth, but you're running out of time." Abigail's breath quickened as she wrestled with her own mind. The weight of her decisions, the ones that had brought them all to this point, pressed down on her like a heavy burden. She had been able to deceive everyone for so long, but now the walls were closing in. Her options were dwindling. Outside the room, Olivia sat, her face pale and tired. She had heard the confession, but she wasn't sure if she could believe it. "She was like a daughter to me," Olivia repeated softly to herself. She struggled with the unbearable truth that the person she had trusted the most was involved in her son's suffering. Could she forgive her? Was there even space for forgiveness in a situation like this? Meanwhile, Ethan's best friend Lucas stood by the window, his hands clenched into fists. The anger that bubbled within him was not just for the betrayal, but also for the painful choices that had led to Ethan's death. He knew he had to decide how to deal with Abigail, justice or vengeance. It was a decision he couldn't make alone, but the weight of his emotions made it feel as though there was no turning back. The courtroom was packed with anxious faces as the trial of Abigail Sanders began its final phase. The once confident woman, now visibly broken, sat in the defendant's chair, her eyes downcast. The prosecution had laid out the pieces of the puzzle, and the defense had tried in vain to cast doubt. But the truth had come crashing down, undeniable and harsh. Detective Avery stood just behind the prosecutor, watching as Abigail's fate unfolded. His work was finally paying off. The investigation that had begun with so many dead ends, false leads, and emotional turmoil was now at its apex. The key piece of evidence, the cell phone video showing Abigail at the scene, recorded inadvertently by a passerby, had sealed her fate. Abigail's confession on the witness stand had been as cold as it was chilling. She had been driven by a twisted desire for control, manipulating those closest to her to mask her true intentions. In her eyes, the emotional pain of her own past had justified her actions. Her son's life could never be returned. But she had found some semblance of peace, knowing Abigail would face the consequences of her actions. For Ethan's friends, the trial had offered no closure. They were left with memories that no verdict could erase. But they had made a pact to honor their friend's legacy. Lucas, his closest companion, promised himself that he would fight to protect the truth, keeping Ethan's memory alive, no matter how painful. The investigators, too, took a collective breath. The case had tested them in ways they hadn't expected, emotionally and professionally, but in the end, they had pieced it together. Detective Avery knew that justice wasn't always clear or easy. It often came at a cost. Yet, in that moment, as the gavel struck, he realized that the truth, while painful, had restored some order to the chaos. Olivia, after the trial, sought solace in the quiet corners of her home, a place where she could finally breathe without the weight of constant worry. While Abigail's conviction could never erase the pain of losing Ethan, Olivia found some semblance of peace. She became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, channeling her grief into a mission to ensure that no mother would have to experience what she had. Over time, Olivia's strength became a source of inspiration to many. Abigail, now serving a life sentence, faced the cold reality of her choices. In prison, her facade of control crumbled. She was left to confront the emptiness of her own mind, surrounded by a world of people who saw through her manipulations. The woman who had once been so confident and calculated now lived a life of regret, trapped in a cycle of bitterness and reflection. Detective Avery, although relieved that the case was resolved, struggled with the emotional toll it had taken. The personal connections he had made with the victim's family, combined with the cruelty of Abigail's actions, lingered with him. Yet, he took solace in knowing that justice had been served, and his role in bringing closure gave him the strength to keep moving forward. In the end, justice was served, but at a steep price. Ethan's life was stolen, and Olivia's world was forever altered. Even with Abigail's conviction, the scars of betrayal and loss ran deep. The question lingers: can there ever be true closure when the heartache is so profound? As for Detective Avery, he was left to wonder if there were other dark secrets hidden beneath the surface, waiting to resurface in the quietest of places. Was Abigail truly the mastermind, or was there more to the story that had yet to be uncovered? This provides a thought-provoking ending, leaving the audience to ponder the implications of the crime and the lingering questions about the investigation. Let me know if you'd like any changes, or if you'd like to proceed to the next part. The case may have reached its resolution, but the shadows linger. What drives people to commit such heinous acts? Is it a reflection of the darkness within us all, or a product of circumstance? As the investigation closed, unanswered questions still whispered in the silence. The wounds left behind may never fully heal. For the family, there will always be a void, one that justice could never completely fill. As for the future, the truth may still have a few secrets left to reveal.